Time to start the afternoon. I won't tell you to silence your phones because I know you already have. I won't tell you about the vendors because I know you've already gone to visit them. And I know everyone's doing their surveys, correct?
Yes.
All right, very good. Thanks, Dave. All right, gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Ullman here today from Buffalo, going to talk to us about dumpster fires and incident response. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. All right, so let's get started. This is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a little background about me. We'll talk about what is incident response and firefighting 101s. We're going to do a little comparison, contrasting. And then we're going to talk about some opportunities that I've learned and some challenges that I've learned. We'll sum it all up and I'll give you some final thoughts. So this is a little bit about me. If you're not familiar with me, I speak at a bunch of conferences. I actually run B-Sides Rochester, which is probably going to be March 22nd this year, for those of you who are interested. I volunteer with a whole bunch of different things, CPTC, CCDC. In particular, I'm on staff at DEF CON and B-Sides Vegas and some other things too. But the most important thing on this slide is my sloth, Flash, my little adopted sloth. So he's my little buddy. All right, so this is the slide most people don't get to see. So those of you who have heard of me or know of me probably know the things you just saw on the previous slide. But I think it's important to understand that I really come here with effectively two hats, right? So I've got the security hat and the firefighter hat. Somebody who came up to us earlier was like, oh, you're wearing your firefighter outfit. And I'm like, yeah, that'd be really cool, except these are just clothes that I wear. But I have been a volunteer firefighter almost 30 years at this point. I was a state fire instructor for a while. I was a certified fire investigator for a number of years. I was involved in J-Fire and all the other things you see here. So I come to you with both pieces of background. And just in case you didn't believe this, because I have literally had people say to me, you can't be a firefighter, no way. Well, there I am. There I am in my gear. This is out of fire a couple of years ago. The thing that I'm looking at, if you can see here, this is what's called a thermal camera. And we'll come back to talking about that. But this was around Christmas time a number of years ago. And anybody in here like Chicago Fire? Anybody watch Chicago Fire? I see at least a couple of people. So I was at this New York State Chiefs Convention this year, and I was very honored to meet these two gentlemen. One you probably recognize because he plays a character on the show regularly. The other you may not recognize, but he's not only a character on the show, but this guy here is an actual retired Chicago fireman. And he does a lot of the information gathering for the show, talks to them, gives them advice, and that sort of thing. So I got to meet both of them this year. All right, so getting into the meat and potatoes. So what is incident response? So I'm going to give you this definition. I won't read it to you. I think you're very capable of doing that yourselves. But this is a very, very, very generic definition meant to be very high level because we don't want to get into very specific incident types, right? We want to keep this high level to be able to show you what we can learn from one to the other. So it's all of the things that you need to analyze and contain an event of some kind. And we have a number of goals with any kind of incident, right? We want to make sure that we're aware of these incidents because if they fly under the radar and they fly under the radar long enough, then we have a target breach, right? I mean, that's exactly what happened with Target. They had a major breach that flew under the radar because they were getting all these notices, but they essentially turned them off. So we want to be aware of what's going on. We want to stop the attacker in their tracks, right? We don't want them to be able to continue. We're going to minimize the damage, any damage they could cause, and obviously we want to prevent future attacks. These are your standard phases of incident response. So first we're going to prepare. Then we're going to identify the fact that there is an issue. We ultimately contain it. We want to get the attacker out of there. we're going to recover, and hopefully we're going to learn some lessons from that. Does that seem pretty familiar to folks? Who here is in incident response now? A handful of you. Who is not in incident response but would like to be in incident response? Okay, a couple people, cool. It is a challenging space. It is a very challenging space. So this is what we mean by those particular stages. So during this preparation phase, we're going to document the heck out of everything, and we're going to make sure we have the tools that we need for this. And then during identification, of course, we're going to be aware that there are attacks. When we need to contain the attacker, we need to be, patching, right? Patching is going to prevent certain kinds of attacks. We're going to block C2s where we can, right? That's certainly a thing we need to be careful of. And in some cases, we're just going to pull the power. Because if we pull the power, now they can't get at anything. And then in other cases, we might pull a network cord. It just very much depends on the situation. By eradication, we're going to remove compromised hosts or remediate, depending on the situation. We're going to restore business functions. And obviously, we want to learn some lessons from all of this to repeat it from happening. So that's weird. So when we're talking about incident handling is a little different from incident response. And I bring this out because we really don't want the person who's doing the incident handling to be the same person that is actually doing the response. Because incident handling has to do with all of these planning things that are going on, and they're the ones that are often that should be asked, where do things stand? How are things going on? Right? How are you making progress with all of this? If your incident handler and the incident responder is the same person, you will never get anything done. Now, in small orgs, you may not have a choice. But ideally, these should be separate functions. All right, so let's talk about firefighting. Several of you who are in incident response, probably none of that, what I just talked about, was particularly unique or different. But how many of you in the room are in the fire service? At least a couple, right on. Fire family, yay. So this is, again, very high level, very generic. We're going to prevent the spread of, extinguish unwanted fire, right? Because we don't really want to extinguish things like the little bonfire you want in your backyard. But that's kind of the very high level. I mean, firefighters do a lot of other things too, right? We often do things like accidents, we handle car accidents, we handle EMS in some cases. It just totally depends on the particulars of the firehouse. So our goals, number one goal, health and safety first of ourselves, because if we can't help ourselves, then we can't help anybody else. But then the public, right? That's what we want to do. And we're going to protect any kind of property, public or private, from any damage. And we want to minimize disruption of community activities. So if you have an accident, for example, that happens on a major roadway, that's a problem. So we want to minimize disruption and still make sure that everybody is as safe as possible. So much like incident response, there is a preparedness cycle with firefighting. These are the stages. So we prepare, then we have an emergency, we respond, we recover, we mitigate in some cases, and we're back to preparation. So these are the definitions, essentially, of each of these sections. So we want to mitigate. This is a little different from IR. We're going to try to prevent future emergencies. So we're going to put in things like smoke detectors and sprinklers in buildings, right? This is how we're going to mitigate. We're going to prepare by doing things like what are called pre-plans. So when you see folks driving up to especially a commercial building, typically we have some kind of pre-plan that tells us something about that structure. It's not all of a sudden we just show up at a building that we've never seen and we don't know what we're doing. Usually, especially with large commercial structures, we need to know, like, is it a factory? Do we have dangerous chemicals inside? Is it a warehouse? Do we have people? All of those kinds of factors. So we need to prepare for those things by understanding what's in our districts. And then, of course, when we respond to things. We're going to try to save property and lives first, really, not property. And then during recovery, we're going to recover by doing cleanup and restoration and repairs. Now, what we mean by that is the cleanup of our gear and whatnot from the scene, but we often have to repair our own equipment because things, they wear out. So we can wind up with a hose that has a problem. We can lose tools. We can break tools. All right, so I want to start this story. This is that same fire that you saw the picture of me in, and actually I'm in this picture as well. I'm the helmet right here. So I want to talk a little bit about this story. So this was a single-family structure, wooden structure, that was on fire. And I am now mostly exterior firefighter. That is the role that I have moved into. And so what I am doing in this picture is I am changing an air bottle. For those of you who are not familiar, air bottles go into a harness, which you can kind of see here. This is the bottle, this is the harness. And so air bottles, depending on the brand and a whole bunch of factors, they can be good for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, in the best possible case, which is usually not the way it works. So how many folks know somebody who's a volunteer firefighter? Lots of hands, right? And how many of those folks are in the best shapes of their lives? Okay. Point. We're not. Many of us do this like on the side with everything else going on in our lives. We have some folks who are in phenomenal shape, but a lot of us are just, everyday folks who aren't necessarily eating well and exercising well. And so the problem is that if you are not in great cardiac shape and you go into a building and you're all hyped up and that bottle would be good for you for 30 to 45 minutes, under normal average circumstances, what do you think happens in a situation where, oh my God, all the things are going on? Yeah, you're going to go through that air a lot faster. So in this particular case, to his credit, the gentleman who you see over here is actually a past chief. And he was actually in pretty good shape, but he came out because in our department, we're allowed to roll with 2 bottles. So you go in for 1, and then when you run out of air, you come out, we change your bottle, you go back in. And that's it. You're not allowed to go in a 3rd time. So he came out, he needed his bottle changed, I was there, I went to change the bottle. I had all my gear on, which you can kind of see in this picture. I go to take the bottle out. So the way this works is you shut it off, you disconnect it, you remove the bottle, you put the new one in, you reconnect it, you turn it back on. I was just doing my job. I did this. I put the new bottle in. I turn it on. Whoosh, I get a big face full of air. This could have gone very badly. Keep that story in the back of your head. These are very hard to see in this light, but there's actually flame impingement here. There's some brown stuff here. Had I been paying more attention, I would have noticed that. This air pack was damaged. That's really dangerous. It's dangerous for me as the person putting the bottle in, but it's even more dangerous had I not realized that and then put the bottle in and we hadn't had something go wrong, and then he went back in. So we'll talk about where this comes into play. So one piece of terminology I want to make sure that you folks understand. I know a lot of you have heard ICS, and this is not the ICS you think of when you think of security, right? This is the Incident Command System. The Incident Command System is this really cool, flexible approach to running an emergency scene. It allows you to coordinate a whole bunch of folks coming into one space to do a job like this. And it's made so that you can grow the scene to something much bigger or have it be a whole lot smaller. It really just depends. But it's, as it says here, an organized response to the problem. And the fire service runs under this umbrella, or should be running under this umbrella for every single call, whether it's something simple like a dumpster fire or whether it's a city block. This is what it looks like. You can see you have an incident commander, and under that you have some other offices like public information officer, safety officer, liaisons, and then down below with the little branches you have things like logistics and finance and operations, and unless we get into a giant incident, we don't usually get to a whole lot of the things at the bottom aside from operations. So what do these folks do? Well, incident command is going to define what it is you're going to do on that scene, right? So the goal, of course, it could be to obviously put the fire out in a large situation, and what are those particular operational objectives that you have with respect to putting that fire out. We're going to have somebody who's running operations. So they're going to deal specifically with the strategy and the tactics of doing exactly what it is the incident commander wants done. Then again, we've got logistics, planning, admin, finance, and while those three roles are important, except in very large circumstances, we don't often see them. Certainly, I can tell you right now, how many of you are familiar with what's going on in Florida, right? Most people, right? I can tell you for a fact every one of these roles is being filled because Florida, anytime you have any major incident, this is what should be happening. And it's happening a lot better than it did, say, for Katrina, because somebody bought a clue and realized, oh, maybe we really should be following this. All right, so now that you kind of understand you have the basics of both sides, let's do a little compare and contrast. So the methodology, although it looks a little different in terms of order, they're really very similar. And I've added lessons learned to both sides, although formally they don't have them. Certainly in both cases, we want to learn something from whatever it is we're dealing with. As an incident responder, you might learn that, oh, I don't know, you're missing a tool you should have, right? So I've done incidents where I got some new hardware I had to do forensic image on for the first time, and whoops, don't have the hardware to do that, so then you're scrambling, you have to order something. And in a fire situation, you might realize, oh, somebody forgot to put gasoline in a saw, or they didn't start it or something. So there's always lessons to be learned. But essentially, the methodologies are the same. But there's also some very big misconceptions, right? Not every event in IR is an incident. And in fact, I work for the state of New York who says only people who get to make that call, that's legal. We don't get to call anything an incident until somebody in legal tells us that's what we can call it. That's it. We don't get to make that call. Incidents are never handled in the same way. I mean, you may have the same basic methodology, right, like we just saw, but every incident's going to be a little different. So we're not going to handle them all the same. And we certainly don't solve them all quickly. Sometimes we can. Maybe we see a pattern and it's simple and we go, oh, it's one of these, right? And that's fine. There's also this weird idea that everybody in an IR team needs to be a rock star, which is crazy. Not everybody does. In fact, not anybody does. You need a good team that comes together. You don't necessarily need one really good person who knows all the things, but you do need, the right amount of people to do all the things, and that could be one or it could be several. And accurate attribution is really tough. And the world really, really, really wants to attribute bad things to some kind of threat actor, and that's just not always possible. We see similar misconceptions in firefighting. Firefighters are not always paid. I told you at the beginning, I've been a firefighter for almost 30 years. Guess how much money I've made as a firefighter? Nothing. I am a volunteer. I get $0 for what I do. I do it because I'm nuts and I love it, but I don't get paid. I am clearly not a big, tough dude, so they're not all big, tough dudes. We don't fight fires the same way. I mean, if you think about it, right? So as firefighters, we are taught, put the wet stuff on the red stuff. That is a very common phrase. What happens if you put wet stuff on batteries? Sometimes badness. The biggest problem right now, and I'll give you a little side food for thought, electric vehicles present a very interesting challenge. And they present a very interesting challenge because you literally can put all the water you want on a car that's in thermal runaway, and you will never, ever, ever put the fire out. Or you'll put it out briefly, and then it'll come back again. Yay. So, you know, it's not as straightforward as you'd think. And that, of course, goes to every fire is not quickly extinguished. There have been fires that have lasted days or weeks, if they're big enough. If you look back in history, and you can see some of the really large fires, like the Great Chicago Fire, that was not a quick thing. There have been some in New York City that are the same. And it's not always a full-time job. Firefighters work all different kinds of hours, shift hours, you know, and sometimes it's a, you know, call-by-call basis. Sometimes it's literally a shift where you work 8 hours, and you come to the fire hall and you hang out for 8 and you go to everything that comes in. It really just varies. So here are some very distinct differences between the two. With the exception of healthcare, and I know in healthcare, IR is a painful place to be, which is, by the way, why I'm not in healthcare, but tip of the hat to any of you who do work in healthcare, because that is a tough place. We rarely have to deal with life safety issues. I was very, very fortunate in that the very first information security officer that I worked for understood, because his background was in emergency management, that when the shit was hitting the fan, it was okay. We didn't need to panic, because guess what? No matter what we do or don't do, no one will die. Again, obviously not true in healthcare, but for the vast majority of folks who aren't in healthcare, there is this tendency to want to be like, oh no, it's the end of the world. IR teams use computers and software, right? They're not using fire trucks, because that would be weird. Although firefighters now use computers a lot more than we used to. As a firefighter, I have to wear special gear when I'm going on a call, because it would be very, very bad if I didn't, right? Because that gear is what protects me from the badness that I'm walking into in whatever capacity that is. And we typically show up in special vehicles. Your IR team doesn't usually need a special vehicle to come to work, although I guess in certain cases maybe there's a work vehicle. And we use, as firefighters, we use water, foam, and chemicals, and that's really not something most of the time you're going to worry about or even want in an IR space, right? Some quick similarities. We need to focus on the immediate issue first. So remember that in an IR situation, we need to figure out what's going on, and hopefully we want to keep it from getting worse. Well, it's the same thing in firefighting, right? We need to deal with whatever the immediate issue is, whether it's a immediate life safety issue or a danger of a limb falling on a house, or any one of a number of things. We're going to use triage to figure out what our best course of action is. In other words, we're going to take a look at all the different possible issues that we have, and we're going to pick which ones we're going to take care of first. They're cyclic in nature. We saw that already, right, with those cycles. We have to think outside the box. So here's a really interesting thing with firefighting. So I have a friend who works for a city fire department, and he had a call for a very, very large individual on the 3rd floor of a house and could not use the equipment he had to get this individual out of the house. He went to a box store, and they bought some stuff, and he assembled some kind of gizmo, and they were able to get this person out of the house. We do the same thing in incident response, in that sometimes we use tools for things that maybe we never intended them to be used for, but it occurs to us, ooh, maybe we can use this tool for something else. And we sometimes bring in outside entities, right? So IR teams, if you don't have one, or if yours is very small and you have a big incident, you might need to bring in an outside entity. Firefighters do that too. It's called mutual aid. And sometimes they're inside teams. Usually, for example, factories will have sometimes inside firefighting teams. All right, now we get to the challenges of the things that I've actually learned, the 6 things that you came here to hear about. So think for a minute about me doing my job, right? What was the problem with me just I'm going to take this bottle off and I'm going to put this new bottle on and I'm not really paying attention. I had tunnel vision. I was focused only on what I was doing. I wasn't paying attention to the rest of the gear or anything else. That's a problem. And if you get tunnel vision, regardless of whether you're in the fire service or in IR, this can go badly. So, because I know you all wanted to see more of this actual fire, this is early on in the fire. What are the cones actually protecting? Anybody have a guess? Nope, not a hose line. What? Not ice, not firefighters. What? Electrical. But how hard is it to tell by looking at this picture, right? Let me tell you, on scene, just as hard. There is a downed electrical line that is right here. Yes, there's also hose, but there's actual electrical line right here. So what did they do at this fire? They put a bunch of cones there. No one cared or paid attention. Probably should have been handled a little differently. So in terms of incident response, we should also be thinking about, is the scene safe? Anybody ever worked in a server room where there was a halon system? Yeah, a handful of you. What happens if you get an alert and you go running into a server room that has a halon system and it's just gone off? You're dead, right? Okay, so there are still halon systems out there. They won't get refilled, but they are still there. And so those gases are deadly. But there's also dangers, whether you're talking about floods, whether you're talking about electrical issues, whether you're talking about political issues, right? Like internally. You want to be very careful that the scene is safe in whatever context that takes. You want to make sure that if you think you have a malware issue, it really is a malware issue, and it's not just a misconfiguration. You know, the whole concept of not panicking. We don't want to blindly acquire a ton of hardware and then have to go through it if it's not necessary. And the ransomware just phishing emails kind of dovetails with the malware misconfiguration. So people often will see something that looks like ransomware and they immediately panic. And it's good to think about that for a second, and instead of just tunnel vision, just jumping right in and going down that path, paying attention. So here's a second challenge. It's really easy to get reactionary, right? On both sides of this. We forget that we have pre-plans. We forget that we have anything in place to deal with this. Most folks really, if they haven't already, should be thinking about, putting some sort of pre-plan in action. In the fire department, like I said, we do that with building pre-plans, but on the IR side, what do we have? Playbooks. Yeah, exactly. Same concept. So this was a very, very awful fire that happened in the Worcester Cold Storage building in Massachusetts. That building was a meat packing plant. It was basically vacant, and it had a ton of meat lockers in it. 2 firefighters went in. They got lost. 2 more firefighters went in. They too got lost. 2 more firefighters went in. They got lost. And at that point, the chief went, "Stop. We're not sending anyone else in this fire." And the department members were furious. But all 6 of those firefighters died because, for a number of reasons, they hadn't pre-planned that building the way they should. And because it was such a maze, when they finally recovered the bodies, they realized they never would have found these folks. So if you have a reaction, oh, they're missing, I have to run in there, right? That's what happened here. They sent 2 more in. They sent 2 more in. That's not good. We do the same things in incident response, obviously not with the life safety issue so much, but we sometimes are asked to do forensics without clear or explicit goals. My favorite examples of that are things like, find the bad thing. Yeah, okay. Well, you'll know it when you see it. Right, just like pornography. We pull network connections randomly. You may need the information you get from that network connection. You may need to know where that's coming from. So it's real easy to just be reactionary. Turning off a machine, same thing. Or, one of my favorites, we'll just shut all the accounts off, because that'll fix the problem. Here's the third one, freelancing. So freelancing, especially in the fire services, you get to a scene, and instead of working as a team and everybody knowing what everybody's doing, somebody goes over here and puts up ladders and then starts going up the back of the building and starts working on the building. But nobody knows they're back there. And then somebody's inside the house and they're squirting water and it goes out the window and it hits the guy in the ladder in the face. This is bad. Okay, but we see freelancing even with incident response. So crossing the screens or feeding a fire via doors and windows, this is the kind of thing that I was talking about with the fire service. In incident response, somebody's really hot to trot, they're going to collect all the things, or maybe not collect all the things they need to. Maybe two people are now getting the same information because they're not having a conversation. You can wind up with data alterations or misrepresentations because people are off doing their own thing. Now for some opportunities. How can we be better at this? The number one thing is to have patience, which is really hard both in firefighting and in incident response because we want to run in and we want to do the thing. So this idea of slow is fast is something that our fire instructors tell us all the time. And what that really means is that you want to be very methodical about what you're doing. And as you do that, you will actually be faster if you're thinking about that. So we want to have some patience. Well, again, same fire. Picture on the left, that was earlier in the fire. And what I was looking at when I was looking through that thermal camera, see this glow that's right here? The fire was up in the eaves in this house. And instead of paying attention and looking through the thermal camera and figuring out where that fire was, there was a little tiny bit of fire coming out of the eaves that you can see kind of right here. They didn't have patience. They went running in and tried to put the fire out, which ultimately led them to having to put a hole in the roof, which led to this. Now it's self-venting, yay. Not exactly ideal. Who's heard of Chegg? Anybody? Few folks, okay. I love this one because I had a boss, we got hit with this. So for those of you unfamiliar, Chegg does a whole bunch of things, but one of the things that it does is textbook rentals for various universities and colleges. What do you think the odds are that the credentials for these rentals is the same credential that the student uses at their alma mater, school, whatever? Really good, 100%, yeah, in many, many cases, right? So Chegg has a breach. We get notified. We have a bazillion accounts, not really a bazillion. I think we had a couple thousand accounts, but we have, just to put it in perspective, we have 3 campuses and 40,000 people, not accounts, we have more than that. And my boss was flipping out over 2,000 accounts being compromised. And I said to him, whoa, stop, this is not an incident. Chegg was breached. People reuse passwords. This isn't an us problem. It is in terms of we've got to reset the accounts, right? We need to do something about that. But our stuff isn't compromised. Why are we panicking about this, right? We need to have patience and think about this. What is the real risk? Accountability. This is knowing where everyone is, knowing what they're working on. This is obviously the opposite of this whole idea of freelancing. We want to make sure there's no duplication of effort, et cetera. In the fire service, we have what are called accountability tags. Those tags hang off of our gear. We usually have 2 of them, and one of them stays on the truck, and if you go into a building or a structure, the other one goes with an accountability officer at the door. And the whole idea is if something goes horribly wrong inside that structure, we know who's in that structure. We can account for where they are and, in theory, what they're doing, so we can get them out if need be. In an incident, we might have some sort of, swipe card access logs, or we might have a manual write-it-in log, which is what this is an example of. Just depends on your situation. If you have a team coming in to do IR, people should not be coming and going willy-nilly. You should know where they are and what they're doing. Did so-and-so leave because they had a family emergency they had to go to? That should be documented. It needs to actually be accounted for. All right, pre-plans. We've already talked a little bit about pre-planning, right? We need to know our environments. We need to understand what we're walking into. Now, obviously, if you work in IR and you work in a consulting space, that's harder than it is if you are working IR in a standard institution, right, where you get to know your environment. But I find that some folks don't know their environments even when they do work in them. You need to know what you're dealing with. There should be lots of documentation. We all suck at documentation. I fully understand that. But we need to be doing things like tabletops. We need to understand where that's all coming from. So firefighting, this is a couple of examples of pre-plans. This one here gives you a sense of where certain things are. I know it's really hard to read, but it shows you where the hydrants are. It shows you where chemicals are. It shows you where fire departments' connections are, that kind of thing. And the one on the right is a similar concept, but it's more of little check boxes. So it tells you all about, again, similar things, like if there's specific hazards that we don't think of. Maybe the roof is particularly hazardous. Maybe there's something about a chemical that they keep. Maybe there is only access to a particular floor a certain way. These are all things that fire departments need to know before they make entry. This is what we were just talking about, right? Tabletop exercises. How many are familiar with backdoors and breaches? If you're not, and you're in the IR space, I would encourage you to look into it. It's a phenomenal card game that was developed by Black Hills. There are now a ton of extra packs that go with the initial pack. You can play this online for free, and it allows you to set up a scenario and work through it with your team. You can do everything from really crazy scenarios to really simple scenarios. Your documentation is going to be key here, and you really should have some sort of incident response team or plan. So we're going to wrap it up here, and then I'll open it up for questions. I want you to think like a firefighter. Avoid tunnel vision, right? Do what we call in the fire service a 360 of the problem. Don't get sucked in, take a step back, and think about it. Act. Don't react. Don't just jump in. Think about what you're doing before you take action. You definitely want to have a plan, and you want to follow that plan. That's key. Have patience. What I like to say is take a beat. Before you do anything, stop. Think about what you're walking into. It's very easy to just get tunnel vision, and we've seen what tunnel vision can do. Location, location, location. Know where folks are, know what they're doing, make sure you document accountability. Pre-plans are your friend, and something like the incident command system can be really helpful in organizing your response. In the ICS system, you never have more than 5 people reporting to any one person, which makes it way, way, way easier to manage. Little shameless self-promotion. I have a book called The Active Defender, which, while it doesn't specifically address the IR stuff, it is particularly good for folks newer to the security field. The idea behind it is that it is looking at defense from an offensive perspective, which should give you a different view of your own network. And with that, I will end with this quote, and then I'll take some questions. I love this quote because I actually started out my first degree is in music industry. I never intended to go in IT. I wound up in IT doing IT support. I certainly never expected to be in security, but I think ultimately I wound up exactly where I needed to be. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
I don't know if you can help with this, but one of the issues I have at my institution is getting my executives interested in doing tabletops. I'm wondering if you've had any experience with that at Buffalo and if you have any sage wisdom to help with that.
So first, let me just ask you, before you give the mic back, what are the pushback? Is it just they're not interested at all, or they don't see why it's valuable? Where's the disconnect? Do you know?
I think it's a priority to them.
Priority to them?
Is it really the priority given their day-to-day challenges and what they're
Okay.
dealing with?
And you work in higher ed? Yeah, okay. So here's what I'll tell you. The beauty of a tabletop is it doesn't have to be very long. But what I would say is, if you look at higher ed and you look at how many of them are getting popped with things like ransomware, start asking questions like, okay, we haven't done any tabletops. Tell me, are we going to pay the ransom? And you're going to get, right? But they need to have those answers before all this happens. Who's going to be in charge when this kind of thing comes down the pike? So I think the important thing is to have them understand the kinds of questions that are going to need to be answered. And the best way to get some of those answers is to play these kinds of things out. You don't have to, you can tell them we're not talking about huge chunks of time, and that will help them better prepare. Legal might be able to also be very instructive as to why this kind of thing matters. And in some cases, insurance will take this into consideration as far as your rates and whether they're going to reinsure you. Those are definitely things that they will ask. So I hope that's helpful. You're welcome. Other questions?
Okay.
Oh, hang on.
Where are we going?
Yep. We got a question up here.
Oh, up here. Right here?
Nope, right here.
Oh, okay.
I have found backdoors and breaches to be really great for the technical side of IR teams. Do you have scenarios where you found it applicable on the executive side?
I think you can make it applicable on the executive side in the sense that you start out with the technical, and then you take a step back and you say, all right, here are the business decisions that would have to be made based on the particular scenario. Here's the technical stuff, but here's the business case that you're now going to have to deal with.
So you kind of, instead of randomly selecting the target cards, you cook it so that it tends into the business decisions as well as the...
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. Because backdoors and breaches is whatever you want it to be. And that's one of the beautiful things of it. It's very flexible. Anything else? All right, I want to thank the Rochester Security Summit for having me, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Have a wonderful afternoon.